Hello everyone, welcome back to History 1151. In this video, we're going to discuss the U.S. Civil War, fought between the Union and the Confederacy from 1861 to the end of 1862. We will discuss the grand strategies of the Union and Confederate armies and some of the most important battles. We will also discuss the individual soldiers themselves, the people who fought in the Union and Confederate armies, from the highest general to the lowest private, and what motivated them to fight in this war. The Civil War has been called many names: the War between the States, the Union War, the War of the Rebellion, or more controversially, the War of Southern Independence or the War of Northern Aggression. People in the years following the conflict, especially in the South, referred to the national struggle as the Late Unpleasantness. Just as there are many names for the Civil War, many different groups within American society, white and black, Southern and Northern, Eastern and Western, all have different reasons for why they took part in this conflict. As far as structure goes, this video and the next one will differ somewhat from our discussion of previous major American wars, namely the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. In those videos, we discussed one theater of operations at a time. In this video, we will consider the Civil War differently, looking at the conflict year by year. We will approach the Civil War in this manner because technological and industrial innovations in the 19th century, rather the mid-19th century, especially with steamboats, railroads, and the telegraph, made coordination between theaters, the movement of troops, materiel, and information, far easier and more practical than it had been in previous wars. During the Civil War, the belligerents, the Union and the Confederates, could engage each other over much larger spaces than could have been done in the wars we have previously discussed. It was far easier to move troops by railroad or steamboat than it was to move them by a sailing ship, or even worse, marching them over land, as had been done in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. It is estimated that Union and Confederate forces fought each other in over 10,000 battles from April of 1861 to April of 1865, when the war officially ended. The war was fought as far north as St. Albans, Vermont, and as far south as Brownsville, Texas, on the Mexican border, although this map doesn't show the St. Albans raid. Land battles were fought along the East Coast and as far west as Arizona, and anywhere in between. The war was fought on the high seas as well, in places as far-flung as the coast of France in the Arctic Circle. As the Union and Confederate states fought each other, the European empires and Latin American republics watched closely, but not officially become involved in the conflict. In 1861, President Lincoln faced the daunting task of fighting a thousands of miles long front against the Confederate States of America. Lincoln also recognized that he needed to balance harsh military action to quickly defeat the Confederacy with a more limited diplomatic approach that would keep the slave-holding border states in the Union and dissuade them from joining the C.S.A. I bring this up because I want you all to understand that the Union's grand strategy at the beginning of the conflict was a limited war approach. The limited war approach was also driven by Lincoln's belief that secession was illegal and that the C.S.A. was not an independent nation, but a collection of U.S. states in rebellion. Thus, the Union military had to respect as many of the Southerners' rights as possible, because Southerners were not really Confederates. They were American rebels who still had certain rights and privileges. The limited war approach had military precedent in addition to political motivation, being used effectively during the U.S.-Mexican War. Most of the Union Army's commanding generals had served in the U.S.-Mexican War, and their experiences in Mexico impacted how they believed victory could be attained. The limited war strategy mandated that the Union focus on defeating the Confederate Army in battle, while also using complicated maneuvers to capture major Confederate cities. The Union Army must accomplish these two things while doing as little damage as possible to the property of Southern civilians, many of whom were Unionists who did not really support the Confederacy. In particular, Lincoln did not want to attack the institution of slavery, fearing that doing so, a violation of his campaign promise, would radicalize the Southern Unionists and push them into supporting the C.S.A., contesting the Union war effort. To this end, the Union Army, at the beginning of the war, would actually return escaped slaves to their masters, although this policy had come to an end by 1862. Union generals like Benjamin Butler argued that returning slaves was a waste of time and strategically inexpedient, as the slaves' masters might be Confederates. Butler and other generals instead argued the Union, to legally avoid returning slaves, should confiscate the enslaved people that had fled to their lines and label the Southern masters' former human property as contraband. Attacking slavery would have also angered the slaveholding border states and potentially led them to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. As I mentioned before, it was critical that the Union not allow the Confederacy to gain more states, especially strategically important border states like Kentucky, whose northern border was the Ohio River, which connected the Eastern Union states and the Mississippi River. Lincoln famously said in late 1861, "I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. Kentucky gone, we cannot hold Missouri, nor, as I think, Maryland. These all against us, and the job on our hands is too large for us." Lincoln also reportedly joked, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." This plan was also formulated by the Union's supreme military commander, General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, whom we discussed before. Having fought in every major U.S. war since 1812, Scott drew on his past military experiences to help Lincoln develop the limited war grand strategy. Remember, also, that Scott was a Virginian and had run for president as a Whig in 1852. And in terms of his politics, he was a constitutional Unionist, not a Republican. In addition to a limited policy on land, Scott called for the blockade of southern ports. The southern economy, before the war, had been dependent on the selling of raw agricultural products, especially cotton, in the north, and in Europe, especially Great Britain and France. With the onset of war, the South could no longer trade with the North, so foreign imports and exports became all the more essential to keep the Southern war effort going. Contrary to popular belief, the South did have an industrial sector and could produce both arms and materiel, but the mostly agricultural Confederacy would have to depend on foreign imports in a way that the Union, with its more diverse food crop / resource extraction / industrial economy, did not. Consequently, the Confederate government would emphasize the construction of blockade runners, sleek, fast ships that had a low profile and used both sail and steam to outrun the Union blockade and elude capture, while importing essential supplies from Europe. The Union was far more economically diverse and self-sufficient than the South, and could provide both guns and butter to its war effort. The South, dependent on cash crops like cotton, would struggle to do either of these things. As such, the Union would use the Anaconda Plan, slow, limited war on land, but a strong blockade on the coast, to bring the wayward southern states back into the Union with as little bloodshed as possible. Or so the Union hoped to do. Lincoln and the U.S. had a very difficult task: to defeat the Confederacy and bring the rebellious southern states back into the Union without angering the border states. It was like walking a tightrope. The Confederacy had a different set of challenges. Confederate President Jefferson Davis recognized that the C.S.A. did not have the kind of resources that the Union did, but he also recognized that the Confederacy did not need to beat the Union, they just needed to outlast them, as had been done by the American patriots during the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. Even outlasting the Union, though, would be difficult, given the South's limited human and economic resources. The South was also vulnerable because its labor was almost entirely dependent on slavery. At this point, the Union had not committed itself to ending slavery, but historically observant Confederates recognized that enslaved people might try to take advantage of the war to escape their bondage, or more dangerously, begin a revolt. As much as it was built on the defense of slavery, the Confederacy was also built on the principle of states' rights, as shown by its name, the Confederate States of America. The Confederate government, in the beginning of the war, was committed to fighting the Union, while also trying not to violate the rights of the states, who preferred to keep their state militias and economic resources for themselves, rather than handing them over to the Confederate state government for the general war effort. One of the reasons the Upper South states had joined the C.S.A. was because they resented Lincoln's demand for state militias to invade the Deep South. Individual Southerners also resented the growth of the Confederate government as well. The Confederate government pressured wealthy planters to give up their cash crop agriculture with the corn, not cotton campaign. The C.S.A. needed more food if it was to keep up with the Union, but planters preferred to grow cotton, which was far more profitable, putting their own livelihoods over the needs of the Confederacy. Poor Southerners would also oppose the C.S.A.'s abridgment of their rights, especially through conscription, which meant losing the labor of their sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers, actually leading to insurrections and draft resistance throughout the South. As time would go on, President Davis would realize that the Confederacy and the Southern pro-slavery nationalism were to survive, then states' rights would have to be overridden for the good of the C.S.A. as a whole. The conflict between states' rights and Southern nationalism would cause resistance to the Confederate government in the South, which we'll talk about more later. With this discussion of grand strategy in mind, we will consider the motivations of the people who joined the Union and Confederate armies. The men who joined the Union and the Confederate armies in 1861 were motivated by a commitment to freedom. Both Union and Confederate soldiers believed that their section was fighting for the same principles of liberty that motivated the American patriots to go to war against Britain in the 1700s, more than 80 years before. Northern soldiers believed they were fighting to preserve the Union, the great experiment of democracy and liberty that triumphed over the old British monarchy and empire. White Southerners believed that they were fighting for freedom as well, states' rights, namely their rights to hold black people as slaves. As far as slave ownership goes, the 1860 census reveals that the 15 slave states, which included the 4 Union border states, had a population of about 12.5 million, with about 4 million enslaved people and about 8.5 million free people. The 11 Confederate states of America had a population of 5.5 million free people and 3.5 million slaves, meaning that nearly 40% of the population was enslaved. Scholars estimate that there were about 385,000 slave owners, meaning that about 7% of free people owned at least one slave. Throughout the slave states, the majority of enslaved people did not live on large plantations, defined as having 200 or more slaves. The majority lived under the control of a white family in a household setting, usually with 1 or 2 other slaves, if any. When adjusting for the size of the average white family, some scholars argue that while about 7% of white Southerners owned slaves, nearly 1/3 of white Southern households had at least one slave, who would have served the entire family. Scholars debate these numbers somewhat, but there is no debate that Southern Confederates even though the majority did not own slaves themselves, benefited from the institution, either directly or indirectly. When Confederate soldiers wrote about their motivations during the war, they seldom directly mentioned the right to own slaves. Southerners mentioned the ideals of the American Revolution, defense against Northern aggression, or states' rights, but they also used terms like our institutions or our culture. This was because the majority of Confederate soldiers did not own slaves, but a large percentage of them, nearly 1/3, would have benefited from the forced labor of a slave owned by a family member. Additionally, the Southern economy as a whole was reliant on the work of enslaved people. I bring up the above statistics not only because it helps us understand the motivations of the average Confederate soldier at the beginning of the war, but it dispels myths that people from a variety of perspectives hold about slaveholding in the Confederate States of America. With this background about the initial motivations of Union and Confederate soldiers in mind, as well as the Union and Confederacy's grand strategies, we can discuss some of the war's first battles. On July 21, 1861, Union and Confederate soldiers faced off near the town of Manassas, Virginia, less than 20 miles outside of Washington, D.C., in what was called the Eastern Theater, which consisted of Virginia and then later Maryland and Pennsylvania. Union forces, commanded by General Irvin McDowell, expected to rout the Confederates, march on to Richmond, the Confederates' capital, and hang old Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree. The soldiers on both sides, but especially on the Union side, thought that the war would end quickly. They would all be an adventure that they would not want to miss. At this point, the soldiers on both sides, in many cases, had not been issued their official national uniforms, blue on the Union side and gray on the Confederate side, so they wore their vibrant militia uniforms to honor their local communities and highlight the pageantry of what they thought would be a momentous battle in a short war. Civilian spectators even rode out to Manassas, following the Union Army, bringing picnic baskets to watch the battle, as if it were a sporting event. The battle was fought around Bull Run Creek, leading Union troops to call the battle Bull Run, while Confederates referred to the contest as the Battle of Manassas. Even the officers, especially on the Union side, were not prepared for a long, protracted fight. Union General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, in his 70s, followed the army, traveling by coach because he was too old and too corpulent to ride a horse. The commander of the Union troops, General Irving McDowell, was more experienced as a quartermaster than as a tactician, and he was not the ideal pick for a battlefield commander. It was also rumored that McDowell was sick from overeating. It was not prepared for the fight as well. McDowell's troops engaged the Confederates, commanded by General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard. In the beginning of the battle, the Union's army had nearly 36,000 troops, outnumbering the Confederates. The rebels began to fall back, but one officer, Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson, whose brigade of Virginia Military Institute cadets had arrived as reinforcement, refused to fall back. Jackson and his more disciplined cadets inspired the rest of the Confederate forces to rally, leading Jackson to earn his nickname Stonewall. In the end, the Union force crumbled when the Confederate troops rallied, and their retreat turned into a chaotic rout as the terrified, inexperienced volunteers threw down their weapons while trying to escape back to Washington. To make matters worse, the civilian spectators created traffic jams with their carriages on the roads, as they too fled the battlefield. Additionally, there was confusion throughout the battle between the belligerents due to the fact that the standardized uniforms had not been delivered. There were Union soldiers wearing gray uniforms, a popular color for Northern militias, and there were Confederates wearing surplus blue U.S. Army uniforms left over from before the war. The variety of uniforms caused instances of friendly fire amongst the green, inexperienced troops, making the battle even more chaotic. Nonetheless, the Confederates held their ground and defeated the Union attack, enduring 2,000 casualties out of their 34,000-man force. The Union experienced 2,700 casualties out of its 36,000-man force. The Battle of Bull Run was significant for a variety of reasons. First, it convinced commanders on both the Union and Confederate sides that their raw troops needed more military training and experience to really be effective in battle. Second, the battle revealed a long pattern in American military history, that while militias were useful as a security force and in irregular warfare, they were weak in pitched battles. The volunteers, many of whom had been militiamen, fought poorly compared to the smaller forces of regulars or cadets at Bull Run. Finally, the Battle of Bull Run/Manassas was the largest pitched battle ever fought on U.S. soil up to that point, although later Civil War battles would be much bigger and have many more casualties. The Battle of Bull Run demonstrated that in spite of what everyone hoped, the Civil War would not be over quickly. Now that we've discussed the first major land battle in the Civil War in the East, we should discuss the first major battle fought in the West. The West, in the case of the Civil War, refers to the Western and Trans-Mississippi Western theaters. The Western theater actually included several states on the East Coast, including North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, but it also included Gulf states that lay east of the Mississippi River, and the upper southern states that lay west of the Appalachian Mountains. In addition to the Western theater, fighting also took place in the Trans-Mississippi West, which included all states and territories west of the Mississippi River, hence its name. The first major Western Civil War battle was fought at Wilson's Creek in Missouri in the Trans-Mississippi West. In general, the battles of the Trans-Mississippi West were smaller, although this does not mean that they were unimportant. In the Trans-Mississippi West, Native Americans played a much larger role in the fighting, although the effect that Amerindians had on the course of the Civil War was far smaller than the more substantial impact they had on the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Of the two belligerents, the Confederacy made more of an attempt to make Indian alliances. Native Americans were divided in whom they should support, but in general, more tribes supported the Confederacy than the Union, if they supported either side. Additionally, the Indians of the Great Plains in the Intermountain West tried to remain neutral and tried to play the Union and Confederacy off of each other. In the end, about 20,000 Native Americans fought on both sides in the Civil War, although the exact number that fought on each side is difficult to determine due to shifting loyalties, as some Native American factions switched sides during the conflict. At the Battle of Wilson's Creek, called Oak Hills by the Confederates, a 12,000-plus force of Confederate soldiers and C.S.A. supporting Missourians attacked a much smaller Union army of about 5,000 troops. Both sides sustained roughly equal casualties. The Union suffered about 1,300, while the Confederates lost about 1,200. Among the killed on the Union side was the commander of the Federal troops, Brigadier General Nathaniel Lyon, the first general to be killed during the Civil War. The Confederates, using their overwhelming force, drove the Union from the field. While the Confederates had won a significant victory, they were unable to occupy Missouri or make it leave the Union. Confederate forces had stretched their supply lines too thin, and they began to retrograde southward, back to Arkansas. Much of the Union's defeat at Wilson's Creek can be placed at the feet of John C. Fremont, the former 1856 Republican presidential candidate and commander of Union forces in the Department of the West. Fremont, despite his limited resources, called for an aggressive strategy against the Confederates, which put Lyon's small army in such a precarious position in the first place. Additionally, Fremont also refused to properly reinforce Lyon, choosing to instead reinforce the city of Cairo, Illinois, which sat on the Mississippi River at the junction of the states of Illinois, Missouri, and Kentucky. Fremont also angered many Missourians with his anti-slavery politics and his decision to emancipate all slaves in Missourian territory that was controlled by the Confederates. These issues, combined with accusations that Fremont was corrupt and supplying his army with subpar gear, led to his removal as commander. By the way, corruption would be a major problem in the U.S. Civil War for both the Union and the Confederacy. Unscrupulous government contractors looking to profit off the war would sell the U.S. and C.S. governments subpar arms and material called shoddy in the 19th century parlance. Corruption like this would actually motivate President Lincoln to dismiss his first Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, in favor of Edwin B. Stanton. Cameron, a former railroad magnate, had used his position as Secretary of War to protect his and his friends' railroads, but he allowed the Confederates to destroy railroad property that belonged to his pre-war competition. Although the Union had been defeated at Wilson's Creek, and Commander Fremont's policies were polarizing, the Union Army was able to keep Missouri from seceding from the Union, while also preventing the Confederate Army from seizing the state. Instead, most of the fighting in Missouri would be brutal, violent, irregular warfare fought between pro-Union and pro-Confederate militias, called partisan rangers. This fighting was acrimonious. It was guerrilla warfare in which the lines between insurgents and non-combatants were blurred. The fighting in Missouri during the Civil War was much like the combat during the Bleeding Kansas struggle that we discussed in a previous video, and many of the Bleeding Kansas fighters fought in the Civil War as well. This community-based and even personal nature of the Civil War in Missouri was very similar to the combat that took place in the South during the American Revolutionary War, where much of the fighting was done by patriot and loyalist militias rather than traditional armies. In 1861, the Union's overall strategy, with a few exceptions, had been limited war. Defeat the Confederate armies while keep the remaining Union border states from seceding. In this way, Lincoln and the Union were fairly successful. Delaware had no interest in secession, Maryland and Missouri had been occupied by federal troops, and Kentucky remained neutral, but leaned towards the Union. So, while the Union had not won the war, the bottom was out of the tub, in Lincoln's words, it was able to continue fighting. In 1862, the Union would struggle in the Eastern Theater, centered on Virginia, but would do far better in the West. Why did the Union do better in the West than it did in the East? In short, the answer was the West's geography, namely its rivers. The Western Theater was crisscrossed by navigable rivers. The Missouri, the Ohio, the Tennessee, and the Cumberland were some of the most strategic. The Ohio ran entirely through Union territory, working as an interior supply line, and the Mississippi flowed southward from Union territory down into the C.S.A., cutting the southern states in two. From strategic urban centers like Cincinnati, Ohio, Cairo, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri, the Union Army would concentrate and coordinate with the Brown Water Navy and use steamboats and eventually ironclads to penetrate deep into Southern territory, using their superior numbers and more abundant supplies to occupy large amounts of Southern territory. During wartime, movement by steamboat over water was far more reliable than traveling by railroad. If the Confederates wanted to stop Union troops from invading by rail, all they had to do was burn a railroad bridge or destroy some tracks, and the Union attack would be literally derailed. The Confederates could not destroy rivers. All they could do was construct forts to try to contest the Union's naval advance. To this end, Union General Ulysses S. Grant, in partnership with the U.S. Navy Flotilla Commander Andrew Foote, began a strategy of focusing on capturing Confederate strongpoints along the western rivers in February of 1862. Some of the most important joint Army/Navy battles were fought at the battles of Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. Controlling the Tennessee River would open a water advance to Corinth, Mississippi, an important Confederate rail hub. The Cumberland River flowed past Nashville, the capital of Tennessee, a state which had a large Unionist contingent. Using overwhelming ground troops and naval force, Grant captured Fort Henry on February 6th. Grant, with his 15,000 troops and 7 ships, made a multi-pronged land and naval assault on Fort Henry, reducing and capturing the redoubt with its 4,000 defenders. Grant lost 40 casualties to the Confederates' 79. 6 days later, Grant used a similar strategy at Fort Donelson, coordinating an overland assault with a naval bombardment. With the capture of Forts Henry and Donelson, the Union was able to penetrate deeper into Confederate territory in the Western Theater, leading to the capture of Nashville, Tennessee, and allowing the Union to advance closer to Corinth, Mississippi. As Grant's Union troops, the armies of the Tennessee and the Ohio, about 63,000 total, approached Corinth, they engaged Confederate forces at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River, near a small chapel called Shiloh, which is Hebrew for peace. Confederate forces, about 40,000, were commanded by Albert Sidney Johnston. On April 6th, a Sunday, Johnston's Confederates attacked the Union force, which had been invading from the north. Grant's forward troops had been separated from the rear of the army, evening the numbers between the U.S. and the C.S. Johnston's army attacked with great ferocity, surprising Grant and his subordinates. Grant's slow response was rumored to be because of his alcoholism, although this report has not been confirmed. The arrival of Union reinforcements under Don Carlos Buell and Lew Wallace stopped the Confederate assault. Additionally, the Confederate commander, Albert Sidney Johnston, died of wounds during the first day's fighting. On the second day of fighting, the Confederates sustained a counterattack from Grant's reinforced army. Without their commander and running low on food and ammunition, the Confederates retreated, giving the Union the field. The Union lost about 13,000 casualties, and the Confederates lost about 10,000 killed, wounded, or captured, over 25% of their effectives. At this point, the Battle of Shiloh was the bloodiest engagement fought in the Civil War, and probably the bloodiest single-pitched battle ever fought in the Americas. It would remain the bloodiest battle fought in the West. Additionally, the Confederates lost Albert Sidney Johnston, one of their most capable military commanders. The Union victory at Shiloh opened the way to Corinth, which the Union captured in late May of 1862. On the Gulf Coast, in the Western Theater, the Union was successful as well, using its superior naval power to capture the city of New Orleans, the Confederates' largest port city, on May 1, 1862. The Confederacy had lost its largest port, but also control of the mouth of the Mississippi River, dealing a major blow to Confederate shipping. With the capture of New Orleans, all the Union had to do to cut the Confederacy in half was capture a couple more urban centers along the Mississippi River. In New Orleans, the Union occupation force, commanded by General Benjamin Butler, whom we discussed before, took advantage of the fact that the city had a large, free black, and Unionist population. Butler prepared for the reconstruction of Louisiana and the bringing of the Pelican State back into the Union. New Orleans, and Louisiana as a whole, had a large free black population who eagerly supported the states rejoining with the Union. The Union would even recruit Louisianians to fight against the C.S.A. On the South Carolina coast, which is also part of the Western Theater, the Union also used its naval might to establish a presence in the Sea Islands. The North had captured these islands back in 1861, but the Union would increase its investment in the region in 1862. As you will remember from a previous lecture, the Sea Islands had a black majority, and the African Americans of the region had developed their own unique Gullah culture. The Union Army, with the help of abolitionist reformers, worked to reconstruct the Sea Islands, freeing the slaves, establishing schools to educate the freed African Americans. They also recruited the newly free black men to join the Union Army as well. The Union's attempts to reconstruct the Sea Islands society was called the Port Royal Experiment, and it would be copied across the South after the Civil War, with the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. The Union did well in the Western Theater when its armies and navy had access to navigable rivers and sea lanes. The Union would struggle in parts of the Western Theater that were more geographically isolated, like the mountains of eastern Tennessee. Although the Union had taken control of western Tennessee, along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, eastern Tennessee eluded them. Instead, the Union sought to incite eastern Tennessee's Unionist population to rise against the Confederate government. East Tennessee Unionists, whom the rebels called Tories, a reference to the Loyalists in the American Revolution, managed to burn some railroad bridges, but they were quickly defeated by Confederate security forces. The Confederates would invade Kentucky in the summer and fall of 1862, with the hopes that this invasion would force the Union to give up Corinth, Mississippi, and bring the Bluegrass State into the Confederacy. The Confederates, under General Braxton Bragg, fought the Union at Perryville on October 8, 1862. In this battle, Bragg's small 16,000-man army faced a 55,000-man Union force, commanded by Don Carlos Buell and George Thomas. The battle was a tactical victory for Bragg. With his smaller army, he had stood firm against the much larger Union force, and even forced the Union to retreat. Ultimately, though, Perryville and the entire Kentucky campaign were a strategic victory for the Union, as the C.S.A.'s invasion turned the Bluegrass State's people against the Confederacy, assuring that it would remain in the Union. In response to the Confederate invasion of Kentucky, the Union would advance eastward in Tennessee, with General William S. Rosecrans facing Braxton Bragg at Stones River, or Murfreesboro, on December 31, 1862 through January 2, 1863. This battle was a minor Union victory, highlighting the difficulties that the Union Army faced when it fought further away from the rivers of the Western Theater. West of the Mississippi River, the Union and Confederates sparred for control of the American Southwest. The white population, and indeed the general population of the region as a whole, was much smaller than east of the Mississippi. As such, the battles of the West tended to be much smaller, and the U.S. and C.S. armies were more mobile, fighting across hundreds of square miles of territory. Initially, the Confederates had an advantage in the trans-Mississippi West, drawing on support from their Native American allies in what is now Oklahoma, and by moving troops from Texas, advancing northward and westward into the New Mexico Territory, what the Southerners called Confederate Arizona. The Union had to move troops from much further away in the north and east. The most important battle in the trans-Mississippi West, and the one that would decide the region's future, was fought at Glorieta Pass on March 26 through 28, 1862. Some historians of the Civil War actually refer to Glorieta as the Gettysburg of the West due to its significance. 1,300 Union troops, mostly volunteers from the territories, commanded by John Slough and John Chivington, faced off against 1,100 Texan Confederates commanded by John Sibley. The Confederates advanced on the Union's fortified position and forced them to retreat. While the Battle of Glorieta Pass was a tactical victory for the Confederates, it was a strategic victory for the Union, much like the Battle of Bunker Hill had been during the Revolutionary War. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as you remember, was a tactical victory for the British, but a Patriot win strategically. The Confederates, just like the British, had taken the battlefield, but they had overextended themselves and were forced to ultimately retreat, giving up New Mexico and the C.S.A.'s designs on the North American Southwest. The Confederacy did not have the resources to occupy such a large amount of territory, and they needed to focus their limited resources on fighting the war further to the east. In addition, more Union-sympathizing Americans were arriving in the West, settling on land granted to them by the Homestead Act of 1862. I will talk more about the Homestead Act, its upsides and downsides, in the U.S. since 1877 course. After Glorieta Pass, most of the fighting west of the Mississippi River was fought between the Union military and Native Americans, those that were allied with the C.S.A. and those that were not. For example, in the summer of 1862, the Eastern Sioux people took advantage of the war to revolt against the U.S. government, which had begun to shrink their reservation in Minnesota. The Eastern Sioux were not allies of the Confederates, but they recognized that the U.S.'s war with the C.S.A. afforded them an opportunity to retake some of their reservation. The Dakota Rebellion, as it was called, failed, with the Eastern Sioux being routed and their leaders being captured and executed by a federal military court. In the Eastern Theater, which included Virginia and Maryland in 1862, the Union was far less successful than it had been in the West. The navigable rivers of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi gave the Union an advantage in the Western Theater, and the Union was able to secure the Trans-Mississippi West due to its superior resources and population. In Virginia, where the Confederate population was higher, the C.S.A. had the advantage, being on defense. Lincoln and the Union High Command, now overseen by General George B. McClellan, focused on capturing Richmond, the Confederate capital. Capturing Richmond, they believed, would demoralize the rebellious Southern population, leading the Confederate government to sue for peace. Capturing the U.S. capital would also dissuade Britain and France from throwing their support behind the Confederacy. This nearly happened in late 1861, when a U.S. naval vessel, the USS San Jacinto, stopped a British mail ship, the RMS Trent, which was carrying Confederate diplomats bound for Europe. Capturing Richmond seemed the best way of demoralizing the South and keeping Europeans out of the war. The problem was the Union armies could not move as easily in Virginia as they could out west. Virginia's rivers were smaller and shallower, preventing the Navy from getting as close to Richmond as it had gotten to Nashville, Tennessee. These rivers were also better guarded by Confederate ships, including ironclads like the CSS Virginia, which sparred with the Union ironclad, the USS Monitor, off the coast of the Old Dominion during the Battle of Hampton Roads, March 8 through 9, 1862. The Battle of Hampton Roads changed naval warfare forever. It proved that the age of wooden sailing ships was over, as they could not withstand fire from the ironclads, nor could they fire enough broadsides to even damage these new, heavily armored vessels. Back on land, the Union could not simply invade straight from the north either. Confederate forces had proved to be too strong in the region, as seen at the Battle of First Bull Run, and the Southern Unionist population was low in the eastern part of the state. There were, however, more Unionists in the western part of the state, in the Appalachian Mountains. Union gains in this region, combined with Unionist and anti-elitist Tidewater sentiment, led to Virginia's western counties seceding from Virginia and the C.S.A. These counties would rejoin the Union as West Virginia in 1863. Even in the 1860s, Western Virginians disliked the culture of the eastern, plantation-running Tidewater people, just like during Bacon's Rebellion way back in the 1670s. We talked about Bacon's Rebellion in a previous video. In the spring of 1862, Union forces began to advance through the Shenandoah Valley in the Appalachian Mountains. The Union had over 50,000 troops in the region. They outnumbered Confederate forces in Virginia, at the time commanded by Joseph E. Johnston and Robert E. Lee, military advisor of Jefferson Davis. The Confederates could only send minimal troops, about 17,000, to stop the Union advance in the Shenandoah Valley. This small force was commanded by Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, the Confederates' hero of First Bull Run. Jackson, a man of great physical and spiritual intensity, pushed his small army to the limit, often ordering them to march 25 miles a day or more. Jackson's army earned the nickname Foot Cavalry for its speed on the march. Jackson moved his troops quickly and concentrated his small force to divide the much larger Union army in order to defeat them in detail. Jackson also made good use of terrain, using the mountains of the Shenandoah Valley to conceal his troops and as natural fortifications from which they could repel Union counterattacks. In the end, Jackson's small army engaged Union troops in about 7 battles and defeated them in all but one. The Union lost over 5,300 troops, while the Confederates lost about 2,000. Jackson's aggressive strategy both frightened and embarrassed Union commanders in the Shenandoah and led to Union leadership, Lincoln and McClellan, to give up on the valley and try a different approach for capturing Richmond. General McClellan favored a complex and strategically sophisticated plan for the taking of Richmond. Using overwhelming naval force, the Union Army and Navy, in a joint operation, would land troops on the Virginia Peninsula, shown here on this map. The Army would then push on to Richmond and ideally end the war. McClellan's plan, by the way, bore many similarities to the one used by British General Charles Cornwallis during the American Revolutionary War. The Union and Confederates would even fight on the ground of the old Yorktown battlefield, starting in May of 1862. Progress on the peninsula was slow. Spring rains had made the weather hot and humid, and the roads were very muddy, slowing McClellan's advance while advantaging the defending Confederates. Additionally, McClellan's Army of the Potomac had been deprived of reinforcements due to Stonewall Jackson's victories in the Shenandoah Valley. The biggest problem that the Union encountered on the Virginia Peninsula came not from the Confederates, but from its own commander. McClellan was a very cautious man, cautious to the point of being timid. Acting under false information from his spy, Allan Pinkerton, McClellan vastly overestimated the strength of the Confederates and did everything he could to delay his advances, demanding additional resources from President Lincoln. Lincoln, who had initially liked McClellan, was becoming irritated with the general, called the Young Napoleon, and was increasingly viewing him as both weak and insubordinate. For his part, McClellan was coming to hate Lincoln as well. He repeatedly disrespected the president and joked about his looks, calling him the original guerrilla. There were other reasons that Lincoln and McClellan disagreed with each other, but we will discuss those issues later. Under pressure from the president, McClellan intensified his advance on Richmond in late June 1862. The problem was, McClellan's delaying had given General Lee, the King of Spades, a chance to fortify Richmond. Additionally, Stonewall Jackson, fresh from his victories in the Shenandoah, had arrived to reinforce the Confederate army in Richmond. giving the Confederates a slight numerical advantage. During the 7 days battles, as they were called, McClellan advanced on Richmond, but his attack collapsed in the face of stiff Confederate resistance. During these battles, Joseph E. Johnston, commander of Virginia's army in the field, the Army of Northern Virginia, was wounded, leading Robert E. Lee to become the commander of the region's combat troops. Due to his wounds and disagreements with President Davis, Johnston would ultimately be transferred to the Western Theater. During the Peninsula Campaign and the 7 days battles, the Union force, about 106,000 at its strongest, lost about 23,000 men. The C.S.A.'s greatest strength reached about 112,000, and it lost 29,000 troops. In the end, McClellan might have been able to capture Richmond in the spring of 1862 if he had aggressively pushed up the Virginia Peninsula and assaulted the city. Instead, he was overly cautious, affording the Confederates a chance to reinforce their capital, prolonging the war. As McClellan evacuated the Virginia Peninsula at Harrison Landing, he wrote a letter to President Lincoln to justify his poor performance during the campaign. In the letter, McClellan also argued that Lincoln should take a conciliatory policy against the South and not attack the institution of slavery in any way. Although McClellan had failed on the peninsula, he was beloved by his troops, who called him Little Mac. McClellan, though he was a poor strategist, should be credited for training the Union's most important fighting force in the East, the Army of the Potomac, helping to assure the ultimate U.S. victory in the Eastern Theater. In response to McClellan's failed Peninsula campaign, President Lincoln authorized another invasion of Virginia, this time taking a more direct approach, similar to the one taken by the Union in 1861, during the Battle of First Bull Run. Lincoln chose John Pope, a veteran of the Civil War in the West and an experienced Indian fighter, to lead this attack. Pope would lead a new force, the Army of Virginia, which would invade southward from Richmond. McClellan was a Democrat and opposed to the Republican Party's increasingly anti-slavery political agenda. John Pope, however, was more sympathetic to the Republicans and was thus more politically aligned with the Lincoln administration. McClellan, angry at both Lincoln and the new General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck, who had taken his job, refused to reinforce Pope as well. Pope overcommitted his army, going after Stonewall Jackson's forces on August 29th and 30th, 1862. Meanwhile, another Confederate army, under General James Longstreet, attacked Pope's force and destroyed its left flank. Pope's massive army, over 77,000 troops, was defeated by a much smaller Confederate force of 50,000. The Union also sustained over 14,000 casualties, double the number endured by the Confederates. For his failure in battle, Lincoln removed John Pope from command and sent him back to the West, where he was the one that suppressed the Dakota War in Minnesota that we previously discussed. Pope's defeat at Second Bull Run and other Union losses would embolden General Lee to invade Maryland in September of 1862. Lee hoped that a successful invasion of Maryland would inspire the Old Line state to join the C.S.A. and cut Washington, D.C. off from the rest of the Union, possibly forcing the U.S. to sue for peace. McClellan remained commander of the Army of the Potomac, and he was given command of what was left of Pope's Army of Virginia to stop Lee. As McClellan pursued Lee into Maryland, his troops had the luck of finding a copy of Lee's plans for his campaign, his order of battle, Special Order 191. From the order, McClellan learned that Lee had divided his forces as well. With this intelligence, McClellan famously said, "If I could not whip Bobby Lee, I'd be willing to go home." McClellan engaged Lee on September 17, 1862, near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, along the banks of the Antietam Creek. At the Battle of Antietam, called Sharpsburg by the Confederates, McClellan's 87,000 troops engaged Lee, who had less than 40,000 on the ground. McClellan assaulted Lee's position and forced him to retreat the next day. The battle was considered a draw, or a slight tactical victory, for the Union, since Lee's much smaller army had survived McClellan's assault, inflicting over 12,000 Union casualties, while sustaining only 10,000 on their own side. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single-day battle of the Civil War. Although it was not a strong Union victory, the Battle of Antietam and Lee's subsequent retreat from Maryland convinced President Lincoln to release the Emancipation Proclamation of September 22, 1862. The Emancipation Proclamation was a document which declared that on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people living in Confederate-held territory were to be considered free. Slaves living in Union slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, were still left in slavery. While the Emancipation Proclamation has been criticized for not freeing all enslaved people, it prepared for the emancipation of about 3.5 million of the nation's 4 million enslaved people. The document immediately emancipated between 25,000 and 75,000 African American ex-slaves, called freedmen, who were living with the Union Army. The freedmen provided services to the Union Army as camp followers, and they also offered labor, building fortifications as well. The Union Army would also begin to arm black men in small numbers as well in 1862. In 1863, the Union would actively recruit black men, both freedmen and Northern African Americans as well. We will talk more about this later. Although Antietam had been a Union quasi-victory, enabling the Emancipation Proclamation, McClellan and Lincoln continued to not get along, leading to Ambrose Burnside becoming commander of the Union Army of the Potomac. General Burnside attacked Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia at Fredericksburg from December 11th through 15th, 1862. The battle was a disaster for the Union. Burnside had failed to take the heights just to the west of the city due to the late arrival of pontoon boats, which were needed to make bridges across the Rappahannock River. Burnside's force, over 112,000 strong, attacked 78,000 Confederates, who were heavily entrenched in the hills west of the city. Burnside's army lost over 12,000 to the Confederates' 5,400 losses. As a commander, Burnside had all the weaknesses of both George McClellan and John Pope. He alternated between being slow and overly cautious, like McClellan, and being needlessly aggressive in the face of worsening odds, like Pope. In 1862, the Union had achieved some important victories in the Western Theater and in the Trans-Mississippi West. The Union government, under President Lincoln, had also issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that the Civil War would end slavery in the Confederate States, giving the Northern public a moral imperative for fighting the war, beyond simply preserving the Union. In the Eastern Theater, due to poor Union leadership, in contrast to the Confederates, as well as geographical features that greatly benefited the defending Confederacy, the Union struggled. The Union government's limited war strategy against the Confederates had failed to achieve the kind of results that Lincoln had hoped for. The border states may not have seceded, but Lincoln's conciliatory policy had not provoked a mass Unionist uprising against the Confederacy in the South. If anything, the limited war approach had hampered the Northern war effort, enabling ineffectual Union generals like George B. McClellan. Whether Lincoln realized it or not, his decision to release the Emancipation Proclamation had not only redefined the North's motivation for fighting the Confederacy, but it would also redefine the Union's grand strategy as well, making it far more aggressive in 1863, 1864, and 1865. We'll discuss the war from 1863 to 1865 in the next video.